Okay, good evening, everyone. We'll make a start. Welcome to tonight's event. My name's David Bell. I'm the Curator of Art Collection at Loughborough University. And tonight's event is the first in a week of events we've organised as part of a Sculpture Week, which is designed to kind of bring to life our sculpture collection across our campus, both through in-person and online events. And kind of ask questions and have discussions related to both the sculptures that we have on our campus, but sculpture in educational context and public sculpture more broadly. So hopefully you've seen the link to all the events taking place this week. If not, I'll share some links at the end of the event. So I'll just quickly talk through how tonight's event is going to work. We're going to have a fairly informal discussion between myself, Hugo Worthy, who's Curator of Leicester Gallery at the Montfort University in Leicester, and Dawn Glover, Head of Creative Enterprise at St Peter's School in Huntingdon. Before we launch into the main event, if I could just ask people to keep cameras and microphones off during the conversation. There will be a chance for participants to ask questions and make contributions towards the end of the event. We've got plenty of time put aside for that. If, however, as the conversation develops, you have a question or a comment that's particularly pertinent, feel free to type it in the chat. I will do my best to monitor the chat, and if I'm able, I'll bring it into the conversation. If I miss it, or I'm not able to bring it into the conversation, or the moment's moved on, we can revisit it at the end in the Q&A session. So structure-wise, I'm going to give a short introduction, say a little bit more about why we're doing this event, some of the questions we hope to raise, although that's by no means meant to be a kind of totalizing, so I'm sure we'll go off in directions that I haven't anticipated. I'll then start the conversation with Dawn and Hugo, and I've got a few questions that designed just to structure the conversation, but we'll keep it fairly loose and fairly informal, and then we'll open it up to your contributions at the end. I also just want to say a few thanks. So thanks both to Hugo and Dawn for joining us tonight. Thanks to you for coming along as well. And also a big thanks to Michaela Degati, the Young Persons Programme Coordinator at Wising. You'll hear a little bit more about Wising Arts Centre as the event goes on. But Michaela's been very helpful and supportive in getting tonight's event off the ground. And I want to say thanks to our team as well. So particularly Simon and Rachel, our marketing team, who've helped get the word out. So I'm just going to share my screen and give a little bit more context about why we're doing this and how this relates to the collection we have at Loughborough. So bear with me. So you'll see this work again later, I'm sure. This is We Were Here by Raphael Chaiko at St Peter's School in Huntingdon. And I came across this work. Hugo, Andrew Fletcher at Leicester University and myself have been having some conversations about history of sculpture and art more broadly in schools across Leicestershire, and been thinking about a collaborative project between the three Leicestershire universities that explores this and perhaps makes work in response to it. It's in very early stages of development at the moment. We've been having some discussions about this. And the initial plan was for tonight's event to kind of focus on Leicestershire. And purely by chance, I became aware of Raphael's wonderful work at St Peter's and thought this is too good an opportunity not to bring into the conversation. I think there are some really interesting resonances with what Leicestershire was doing, but as we'll discuss, some key differences as well. And obviously it's 70, between sort of 50 and 70 years after Leicestershire's collection was really being developed in earnest. So the artistic context and the social, political, economic, educational context in which these works are being produced and cited is very different. So I think hopefully we'll tease out some of those similarities and differences as the event goes on. As I said, this event is part of our Sculpture Week. So please do feel free to have a little Google and look at other events we've got coming up, and I'll pop some links in the chat at the end. So Loughborough University, across our campus, we have around 40 publicly accessible sculptures. And a lot of these date from the post-war period, and particularly the 50s, 60s, 50s and 60s primarily, and very early 70s. And we have these on campus because at the time, Loughborough University was a number of different institutions, a technical college, teacher training college, an art college. And these came under the auspices of the local authority, unlike universities, full universities. And Leicestershire Education Authority at the time had a number of quite unusual policies around pedagogy, school design, and one of its policies that is much commented on was populating schools and educational spaces with works of contemporary art, normally purchased, occasionally commissioned specifically for those spaces, by leading artists of the day and young up-and-coming artists. And they partnered with galleries in London to identify artists and purchase work and cited it in schools and campuses across the county. So we have works that Lynn Chadwick's The Watchers is perhaps the most prominent of those on our campus. We have this work by Geoffrey Clark, who's going to come up again in a minute. And this is the work by Margaret Traherne on our campus as well. So those three came into our collection through Leicestershire Education Authority, and there are a number of other works as well. Obviously, tonight's event is focusing on schools rather than university environments. So I just wanted to share a few examples of some works in Leicestershire, one of which I know Hugo's going to mention later as well. So Bosworth Academy in Desford on the outskirts of Leicester still has this 3B series number 2 by Bernard Shotlander. This is listed. In fact, this image is taken from Historic England's listing information. So, a major work by a major sculptor and designer working in Britain in the post-war period. This photograph taken from the brilliant Lynn About Loughborough blog, which is a local historian in Loughborough, shows a work by Willie Sukop on what is now Charnwood College in Loughborough. It was previously Burley Community College. Willie Sukop was an artist that Leicestershire used a lot, and so we've got some of his works on campus. And he actually made more than one edition of this series of zodiac signs. So I think 3 schools across Leicestershire have them, although they don't all survive, I don't believe. And talking of not surviving and coming back to Geoffrey Clark as promised, this is a rather wonderful work that he made called Estonia. This is clearly not sited outside school, but it was later purchased for and installed at Robert Smith Secondary School in Market Harborough in the south of Leicestershire, where it remained until 2014, at which point, at least according to one blogger, and this seems to be backed up by records, it was sold via auction for £360, and it was sold to a sculpture park in Surrey which is open to the public, so they installed it, but the works there are for sale. They were listing it for sale for £40,000, and it is no longer there, so presumably someone has bought it. Whether they paid the full amount or not, I don't know. But I think that's an interesting thing to think about, and this is one of the things that we'll think about in this event. It's not just about the process of commissioning sculpture for schools or installing sculpture in schools, but what happens to it over time, how it's valued, how those values change, whether it matters that work is lost or sold or perhaps not appreciated over time. It's the fate of public sculpture, very often to be forgotten, not to last. So there are questions there about what we should do and how that institutional memory might get preserved, at least so that decisions can be made that are better informed. This is another example. I think Hugo's going to talk about this work. This is Philip King's Dunstable Reel at Countersthorpe College in Leicester. And as this screenshot from the ITV website suggests, this was found under a hedge where it was believed to have been chucked in the late 90s after being taken down, having been deemed a health and safety risk. Fortunately, someone realised what it was. It's been restored and reinstalled. And if you're interested, I recommend having a look at that news, play the video, the ITV regional news piece that they did in 2022. It's got some students and teachers from the school talking about the restoration. I'm conscious that the examples I've given are secondary schools, and obviously St Peter's is a secondary school. So I just wanted to mention this Blue Moon by Derek Boshier, which is at Holywell School in Loughborough, which is an infant and junior school. Had hoped to have someone from Holywell with us tonight. Unfortunately, as I invited them, it was announced they were going to be Ofsted inspected. But I know that this sculpture by Derek Boshier is still in the school, and is certainly people I know who've had children at the school in recent years have said it is still activated. Children sit around it, it's kind of used in the curriculum. So it plays a role both obviously it will play a role in the kind of extracurricular imaginal space of the school, because children will see it and wonder what it is and probably make things up about it, as will staff, but is also used more formally in the curriculum. So just to sort of frame the conversation a little bit more, some of those questions I think that kind of animated my thinking about tonight's event really do relate to those, not just the process of installing sculpture and getting sculpture in schools, although I think that's really interesting as well, but the lives they play. It's very easy often to find the official story of a sculpture. This is what the sculpture intended, this is what the commissioning organisation thinks, this is the artist, this is the kind of art institution blurb about a sculpture. But public sculpture is public, and its meaning, therefore, is going to be determined by the public or its publics. And in school context, that's quite a specific public. And school is obviously a very formative time in people's lives. They're very unique institutions in a number of ways. So I think thinking about those questions is really important. And I was just going to quickly introduce a few ways that these questions were thought about in the post-war period, not just in Leicestershire, but across the country, where there was a big move to populate schools with art, including sculpture. So the title of today's event, Something Plus, comes from Philip James, who was the first director of the Arts Council in 1949, who said that art in schools offered something plus, a civilizing influence and an encouragement to unhurried contemplation. These quotes I've taken from Natalie Bradbury's brilliant PhD thesis on art in the Pictures for Schools programme and art in schools more broadly. In Leicestershire, the attitude was perhaps a little bit more participatory and active. And it wasn't just this kind of thing that was brought in to civilise, but children and teachers it was thought they would make meaning together. So Bradbury describes children as artists, creators, as consumers, and as critical observers of art and culture through the bringing of art into educational spaces. And Herbert Reed, the kind of cultural thinker, was a key influence on this development, and he thought that art in school would stimulate active production rather than passive appreciation. So it wasn't just something that children and staff would look at, but it was something that would be brought to life through their engagement with it. Children should cooperate in their own environments. And Reed had an explicitly political agenda. He thought this would enable children to grow up, to be confident and shape the world in which they lived. There were disagreements, though, or tensions. So Eric Newton in The Guardian argued that sculpture in schools prepared children for life as consumers. So they would learn to appreciate objects aesthetically, and as spending power increased in the post-war period, they would be able to determine what they wanted in their house and shape their house so it was aesthetically pleasing to them, and that would drive up the quality of design in Britain. And that was a lifelong benefit. So you can see there are these sort of tensions even in the post-war period about why we might put art or sculpture in schools. And one of the things that I've been thinking about in relation to this event is what sculpture perhaps does or doesn't do that other art forms do or don't do, or whether we should make those kinds of distinctions, and whether it's useful to separate sculpture out from other art forms in general. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask the first question, and this is for Dawn. And really, it's just an invitation to introduce the project with Raphael at St. Peter's. So if you could say a little bit more about it, how it came about, the selection process, and once that selection was made, the role that students and staff at St. Peter's played.
Okay, hello everyone. So yes, the project itself started as part of St. Peter's Learn, Aspire, Exceed curriculum, which it's an opportunity in the school week for our Year 7 students to encounter experiences outside of those normal subject areas. So some of them are still, like this one, linked to art or a different language or puppet theatre or something like that. So it's different to their usual curriculum. And we've been working with Wysing Arts Centre for several years, and mostly that has focused on either workshops at Wysing or artist workshops based in school. And so for the 2 years prior to Raphael's project, we had different artists in throughout the year rather than one artist in residence. And then therefore during this LAE sessions, the student experience differed greatly. And it was in the spring term of 2022 that we discussed the idea of having a project on a much larger scale, meaning we'd have this one artist through the year. And as the process went, it was in the summer term of 2022, Whiting shortlisted 2 artists, and I got together a group of year 7 to year 10 students. The work of those artists was presented to those students. There was a kind of a Q&A with the students, and they selected Raphael as the artist that they would be the most excited to work with. And actually each year since then, it's been the year 7 cohort that have just finished who are the interview panel, if you like, for the prospective artists for the following year. And so we've got that coming up later this week, actually, thinking already ahead to next year. But the year 7s, they are quite a tough crowd. They ask some really tricky questions, and as I said, that's the way that we selected Raphael. But then the project itself, the live project, started September 22, and over the course of that academic year, Raph worked with almost 270 students, and they were on this kind of rolling 3 weeks worth of LAE, the curriculum. As I said, they went round to other subjects as well, so they had 2 sessions with Raph, and then 1 with me, and then they moved on. But it meant, as the project evolved, if you like, over the course of the year, the students were able to give their feedback, and Raph and I were working really closely with the Whiting team, so Rosie, Michaela, who you mentioned, Ruth and Zena, and that meant that there was the opportunity to adapt the workshops in terms of the student responses, and in terms of what they were doing in the workshops. I think you've got one of the slides I sent you that has got some of the students' drawings on. So they were looking at using AI image generation by a creative writing. They made these kind of time capsules, and the process of the time capsules, where they were looking at or kind of questioning their ideas for the future, and considering what they'd like to see eradicated from the world, what they'd like to keep, and creating these sort of images and inventions to support school life, working, farming, so kind of machinery, and they're working with drawing and collage, and their drawings, became part of the inspiration. All of that work was gathered together. It was scanned every week, and Raph kept a kind of collection of those. And we realised fairly early on that there was this really interesting connection between Raph's kind of family past and working in farming and factories, and actually it mirrors completely the surroundings of St. Peter's and what our students experience, where there is very much a mix of rural farms and the town itself, and then the commercial factories, a lot of which is situated along St. Peter's Road, where the school is actually based. So I think I can see that you've got some of the drawings. So some of them show parts of the time capsules, and they were looking at creating these sort of inventions of how we could make a better world and what they could use for that.
Fantastic. And I really like the one that if plants were grown inside, they would grow all year round because there would be temperature machines. So there's a kind of transformation of something quite functional, or it's utopian, it doesn't exist, but there's quite a functional object into a sculptural object, which obviously is primarily aesthetic rather than functional. So there's that, and I think that's, if you look at children's responses to sculpture in schools, very often they will ascribe functions to sculptures that are not obviously representative. So they'll say, "Oh, I think it's a big tap and you can turn it," or "I think it's a tube and food comes through the tube." So there's a nice interplay there between kind of functional aesthetics and then sculptural aesthetics, which are more commonly assumed to be devoid of those kinds of utilitarian purposes. Thanks so much. I wonder if I could just ask a little bit about once the work was being produced, the sculpture being produced and cited, were children involved in offering feedback or sort of thinking about whereabouts in the school that might go, or was that a discussion more with yourself and estate staff at the school, and how did that work, and the kind of physical locating of the work?
So where they were located was very much a discussion, I suppose, with myself, with Raf. So he was walking around the school site, and Michaela as well, and picking those places, and as well as the large piece of work, the sculpture at the front of the school that you've shown. There are a series of there's 4 other smaller pieces as well, and I think really that the production of those came out of exploring the site, and finding these spaces. They're like little niches that used to, quite some time ago, I mean, the time I've been at the school, they haven't been in there, but they used to hold fire extinguishers. So these little niches, which the other pieces of work, which are on the, I suppose, the other slide.
Yes. I'll bring it up,
the other set of images, if that you can see them, how they kind of fit in, and now the sculptures themselves fill the recess.
I'll just get those images up so people can see. And are these, they're obviously the main, I say the main sculpture, the sculpture that's sort of been used as the lead image. So the one in the centre on the bottom there is obviously installed on the outside of the school. But these sort of the sculptures that are installed in these former fire extinguisher nooks, these are around are they in like art classrooms or just spread around the school?
No, they're completely spread around the school site. So one of the top right hand one is in an English corridor. The one on the left hand side is in a corridor that leads from English actually towards the DT department. The top middle one, that sort of kind of stylized eye with a roundel in it, is above the entrance into the main hall. So all students, when they go in for assemblies, they pass that space. And then the bottom left is outside our examinations office. So they're people across the school, different roles, and the students, they can experience them all around the site.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's fascinating. I love that idea of just kind of wandering around. It's something that happens on our campus. You sort of turn a corner and there's a sculpture that seems completely out of place. Well, out of place is the wrong word, but it takes you out of the everyday. It jolts you out of just the kind of mundane. You're walking to a meeting, or whatever, and suddenly you're face to face. Hugo, I'll turn to you, and I wonder if you could outline your particular interests in the sculptures that that Leicestershire Education Authority purchased and commissioned for schools and colleges across the county, and if there are any aspects that you think are particularly pertinent to consider today, perhaps particularly in light of what Dawn said, but any other questions particularly relevant for this moment as well?
Sure, thank you ever so much, David. So I've had a long-standing interest in pedagogic practices within the context of contemporary visual arts environments, with museums, with galleries, with exhibitions practices, learning practices within galleries, and then thinking about the way artists kind of function within school settings. I'm going to give just a really quick bit of context about me, and then kind of dive into the Leicester, which seems a little bit self-indulgent, but it might help kind of explain how I got to Leicester, and that interest in those kind of early collections. So I don't know if anyone remembers a program called Creative Partnerships, which was an Arts Council funded project from the early mid-noughties. And it was lots of funding to put artists into school settings, and artists from across disciplines. And that was the first time I'd worked directly in a schools context as the curator on the project. And I worked with 4 artists, 2 of whom I'm going to mention, a guy called Glenn Bolter and a woman called Ellie Harrison, who's now based in Glasgow. And the project then led to an exhibition called Process of Living. And I want to quote kind of two things from that. One was the work that Ellie Harrison produced. We can look at it later potentially, but a question that Ellie asked, which was, she's, for people who don't know her practice, she's quite visible as a kind of activist artist. She produced the Glasgow Effect kind of about a decade ago as a piece of work. The question she asked was kind of, what am I doing here? Which seems like a really kind of self-evident question. She was like, everything that's being done in this school is being done better by the teachers, by the operational staff, by the dinner staff. Everything has a role, and as an artist, what am I expected to do in this context? And I think that question has kind of resonated for me as a pivot and a frame for thinking through kind of how contemporary artists can engage in learning settings. And I think we also we live in a period of kind of like progressive move to an also understanding the social responsibility of art. And out of that process, we created a project called this exhibition called Process of Living. And Process of Living was based on this extraordinary program to build a school by an artist called Bruce McLean. And Bruce created, working with local authority architects, I've got a really terrible image. If we can find the image, that's kind of probably helpful. An image of North Dalry Primary School. And Bruce commissioned his artist colleagues to produce artworks for it. He designed the exterior as two kind of sculptures. It was the whole school designed from top down by an artist, and quite visible, well-known artist. And what became really exciting about that was kind of then he talked about this idea of kind of like, they let us do what we want with the fabric of the school, but they wouldn't let us anywhere near the curriculum. And so that became kind of a really interesting idea about kind of like what the parameters or edges of kind of like arts practice in educational settings were. And then I think for me, over the past decade, maybe a decade and a half ago, I encountered through Whitechapel's archives an exhibition, I think 1971, 72, you can correct me on the kind of the dates for it, David. So this image you can see now is the primary school in North Dalry, and you can just see up in the top left-hand corner this massive piece by Bruce, which sits over the entrance to the school. And it's a really interesting, if you take the kind of the model of kind of sculptural practice as pivotal to the educational context, and providing kind of space, this school is kind of the logical conclusion of it. It is built as a work of art, and it is peppered with individual works of art throughout. And I think also interestingly, because Bruce was working with Bill Alsop on the project, it really quite effectively and interestingly negotiates the relationship between the architectural identity of the building and the kind of the sculptural identity of the building. So Bruce created this kind of this school as a sculpture, and it's really interesting because now the school, if you go to the school's kind of website, it doesn't mention it. Like it's very much a kind of a straight presentation of a local primary school with some really good facilities, but the good facilities aren't the art. The good facilities are the nice PE hall. So this project took me back to encountering this project, this exhibition at Whitechapel, which was the Leicestershire Art Collection display in 1971. Took me back into the histories of sculptural practice and visual arts practice within educational settings within Leicestershire. And what comes out of it is that kind of two things running concurrently. Leicestershire was a centre for what was a national push towards kind of engagement with and presentation of the arts, both painting and sculpture and prints within the context of kind of schools environment. But also, and I think kind of what I want to focus on here, maybe, it was also the kind of centre of this kind of really progressive liberal education policy, and that became known as what was first presented as the Leicester Experiment, which was a move towards a flat education system, a comprehensive education system, so the removal of the grammar system. So Leicestershire in 62, I think, became the first county to remove the grammar school system, which correlates really closely to this kind of interest in visual arts and sculpture as a part of the educational process. And for me, what I became really, really interested in is this kind of narrative of liberalisation and opening up, the value of the arts within the context of schools, the presence of the arts and the commissioning of arts for schools and the acquisition of arts for schools leads to the kind of the jewel in the crown of Stuart Mason's time as the head of education within Leicestershire. And that was the opening of Countersthorpe College. And Countersthorpe College, should we pull up Dunstable Reel? Is that all right, David? Countersthorpe College, which is now Countersthorpe Academy and continues to run as a kind of a school, was the first, and not quite the only, but it was the first non-curricular or open schooling structure created through the state. So people will have heard of Summers Hill as a kind of an open school. There were several kind of like private versions of these kind of open educational settings, but Countersthorpe in North Leicester was the first state school to kind of take that on board. And the architecture of the school was supposed to reflect this. It was kind of built in a round, and it was awash with commissioned artworks and acquired artworks. And this image that you've seen previously is Dunstable Reel by Philip King, and was where it's been reinstalled. It isn't where it existed before. The Dunstable Reel existed in the centre of the round courtyard that formed the kind of centrifuge of the space of the school. So this kind of idea of a liberal open space is embodied in the idea of a sculpture at the centre of the school. And I think for me, what becomes really pivotal or really exciting and hugely relevant at the moment in kind of an environment which is quite tightly curricularly controlled, is that sense of artworks, art objects as spaces of openness, spaces in which learning is relatively unstructured, relatively intuitive, relatively responsive, rather than something which is kind of framed by a set of partially predetermined kind of outcomes. And I think for me, that faith, that belief in the kind of the value of art is incredibly seductive. I think there is also then a really significant challenge around this, and one that I think projects like the one we're talking about with Rafael start to overcome, which is where artists are coming in from outside, dropping in like large artworks. Often, the majority of these artworks were not commissioned. They weren't site specific. They were acquired from galleries and put into school spaces, absolutely underwriting the value of art, but also underwriting the idea of a hierarchy and underwriting kind of a model of practice in which art is a kind of almost mythic identity which comes into the kind of the ordinary space and transforms it without direct kind of interaction with the schools, without necessarily direct interaction, but possibly with the architects or the designers, and without necessarily direct interaction with the teachers, and certainly not with the students. So I think kind of there's this really interesting period of time where this idea of art as a sort of a self-enclosed value is embodied in the Leicestershire collection, and then I'm really excited about kind of how that translates into a model in which artists are embedded in schools, artists in residence programs, in which the young people are super closely involved in the development of the work. They will have direct experience of the artist, and we move towards something which is a much more generous model of what a kind of an artistic practice in a school looks like. And I think that it's really easy for me in 2024 to look back 75 years and point out the kind of the gaps that exist in that kind of commissioning process. But I think also holding on to the sense of a value in sculpture, and I would say sculpture particularly, but a sense of a value in artistic production in educational setting, and kind of in the idea of kind of arts as something which is accessible and meaningful and transformative for people who encounter it. And I think I'd come back to kind of this divide between a model of practice which is kind of top down to a certain extent, and something which is much more kind of organic in the way that I think probably a lot of artwork is produced now. But I think this kind of reflected a really deep ecology. So I'm going to just finish with kind of there's a book called Culture and Consensus by a guy called Robert Hewison, which is a really kind of pivotal narrative around the development of kind of cultural policy across the UK through until kind of the early noughties. And one of the points that Hewison makes really effectively is that, and one of the shortcomings of kind of the original foundation of kind of like Maynard King's Arts Council is that it's built on this model of quality. It was never about supporting community practice. It was never really designed to support the people making work or young people making work. It was about enabling communities, and in this case, school communities, to have access to great art, which was produced sort of somewhere else and then kind of brought in. So I think there is something extraordinary about the kind of the Leicester Education Authority collection. It embodies a huge amount of value, but I think it is of its time, and I think it's really what's exciting is using that as a kind of a starting point or a springboard to think about what artists can do and what art can do and what sculpture can do in contemporary settings. And the project through Weissing and St. Peter's seems to me like a beautiful example of that.
Thanks so much, Hugo. Building on that, Dawn, I wonder if you could say a little bit about what students took or are taking from their involvement in the project with Raphael and Weissing. And I guess there are three aspects I'm particularly interested in here, and I think one of them in particular follows on really well from what Hugo was saying. So the first is I've called it project management, but really their involvement in that process of selecting the artist, etc. The second is, now that the works have been installed, how they've changed students and also staff, teaching staff and non-teaching staff, how it's changed relationships with the school environment. So when people are moving around the school, or how have people responded to the work in situ? And then the third is how the Raphael's work has shaped the imaginations of students and staff at St. Peter's more broadly. Whether that is through discussions in the classroom or more informal means, just by virtue of their presence.
Okay, so thinking about the first point, the first thing you asked about how the students, I suppose, were involved. The very early workshops, the students were aware that their ideas or their creations would be part of a kind of collaborative generation of ideas for Raphael's work, but that it wasn't necessarily going to be, anything that they produced would be that particular piece. I think in the very, very early stages, when the first workshops are happening, there wasn't a distinct idea as such as to exactly what the form of the artwork or artworks would take. And I think, as I said earlier, where these extra spaces were found around the site, then the ideas kind of grew out of those as well. I'm very conscious I'm kind of talking about Raf's ideas when he's here with us on this evening. But also Weissing worked incredibly hard to secure extra funding. So alongside the fact that our head teacher, so it was our deputy head at the time, who the Learn, Aspire, Exceed curriculum kind of came through her as something that she really wanted students to be involved in other aspects of life, school life, and working collaboratively would be a big one of them. But so they think outside of their subject areas. So both Emma, who's now our head of school, and Christopher, who is the executive head, really supportive of the arts and really pushed with our Academy Trust that we're part of. So they put quite a bit of funding behind it initially, whether extra funding was sourced or not. So we're really lucky as a school, as an art department, and sort of beyond that we have that kind of support for any of the projects. Quite often, any kind of conversation like that with Christopher I'll have, he'll say, I'm not sure that I'm the best person to comment on what you want to do, but everything sounds exciting and it's the right thing for the students and the school. Really kind of put lots of ideas behind that. So as I said, the project kind of grew as the time went on, and as well as the year sevens, there were groups of GCSE students, or a small group of GCSE students, that went and did some clay workshops with Raf at Wysing. So one of those pieces is that piece that sits over the entrance to the hall, the main hall. Out of the groups of students, Isabel's piece was chosen by Raphael, and he's put that and combined that with a piece of his own work. So that's sort of this collaborative piece is untitled, and I said it takes the form of this kind of stylized eye that looks over staff and students. So in terms of people kind of moving around the site, initially, so the install was September 23, right at the beginning of term. So the big piece at the front of school, people noticed that when they came in on the professional day. Staff were noticing that. Some people, I didn't really know that was happening. So the kind of awareness grew, I suppose, as then people were going to their classrooms and seeing the other pieces. But there were the smaller pieces have aspects to them other than the one over the main hall, where students collaborated directly with them. So I don't know whether you're able to put the slide up again that's got the artworks or the sculptures on. So because I can refer to those. The one that I believe on that slide appears on the bottom right. So that one is attendance list 1. Oh no, sorry, I've got that wrong. It's attendance list 2, that one. So when the GCSE students were at Wysing with Raf, he's taken casts of their fingers to form this kind of attendance list. So they were actively there in that place. I suppose coming back in a lot of ways to the We Were Here, the producer's title, and kind of linking those together. Attendance list 1, which is the one that has the fire bell over it, so it's the one on the left-hand side, in fact, was from the year 7 students. They were asked to chew gum during one of the workshops, which I think they were kind of slightly aghast and surprised that we're actually being asked to chew gum in a lesson to start with. But there's a central panel within the head shape that's created that's got this chewing gum, so kind of there forever, featuring that they've got attendance in the school, both the cast fingers and the gum, and I think just what the students really took from the project, go back to the year 7s, if you like, the creative freedom that was there. They're using their imagination to design all sorts of things, whether it's future living or these working ideas, maybe some of the rules and restrictions, but that will come in our kind of more formal art lessons, if I want to call it that. Though all of those sorts of things were out of the way. Even their creations, they didn't need to be able to engineer what this the piece of machinery they were creating or any of their ideas. They didn't need to be able to work out how they were going to be made. They were very much these sort of ideas people. And I think one of the things I'd say about that is quite often in art education, in our more formal lessons, we do see this kind of almost fear or self-doubt that starts to creep in. Year sevens, they come in and a lot of that is not there, so actually capturing them at that point. And what I'd really hope is that the sculptures remain as a kind of reminder of that, holding on to what they were doing in those sessions with Raf, and that they had that complete freedom, and that there wasn't anybody saying that what they were doing was right or wrong. And I'd hope that they keep hold of that that sort of enjoyment and think about that when they're producing other creative work or working at home or anything like that, because I think that's really, really important. And sometimes it just disappears as students move through school. But in terms of staff, I suppose, so there's definitely a great deal of pride, I think, amongst the students. One thing I noticed was as each group of students became involved, a new group in the workshops, I would, as part of my role, be going around to their other art lessons or even their DT lessons, that sort of thing, and they would really quite excitedly tell me that they were going to be in the next group, they were in the next rotation, and always then when they'd had their sessions with Raf, sort of disappointed that it was me in that third week and that they weren't. But where is he? Why is he not here today? Well, they really loved that, having that close connection with an artist. It's something the vast majority of them hadn't experienced before, and as I said, that message was passed around from student to student throughout the year. In terms of staff and their sort of thoughts about the pieces, it became very much a kind of discovery of them, I think, as they moved around the site. I had both comments of how amazed people were and how what sort of clever use of the spaces as well, kind of giving them a new space, a new life to those spaces. The colours on the main piece have, I suppose that they're probably not as bright as they were when it went up in September 23. And I did have one member of staff who's just really not keen on it. It's just really, really bright and I just can't get past it. Who stopped me only, I think it was in February, just before we were about to break up for February half term. So I've got to say something, because what I said to you before just wasn't. It's not true. I can completely see it now. It's grown on me. The colours, the colours, maybe they've changed slightly, and just I suppose they've kind of grown into the space, and people have been more kind of aware of them. How we will continue to use them over time. I think they make a good. They're great for kind of almost directing people. They become a waymarker around the site. We do talk about, as we started on our new project in September of this academic year, with a different artist, with each group as well. We talk about the sculptures that are around the site, and talk about although this year's project is very different, how these projects work and how they're playing a role, each of the students, in the kind of outcomes that we've got across the site.
Lost my buttons there. Sorry. Thanks so much. I wonder if I can ask a follow-up question about one of the things I think that's interesting about sculpture is that at least the presumption of longevity, because it's we can all remember the feeling this happened very rarely to me, but as a child having a work of art or a painting on the wall at school, and it would be there for a term and then it would be taken down. Maybe if you were very good, it might be on the main corridor for a little bit longer. And, the odd really brilliant artist when I was at school, they'd left the school and their art was still on the wall. And it was like, wow, they left like 3 years ago and their art's still here. But with sculpture, some of the Leicestershire schools still have work from 60, 70 years ago. Does that presumption of longevity, does that change how the children feel about, or the students feel about the work they've been involved in? The sense that when they're adults, potentially, I don't know if there's I don't know if there is a lifespan of work, but potentially when they're adults or, much older teenagers and they've left the school, the work they were involved in making will still be there. Has that kind of changed what it means for them at all, do you think?
I think it's difficult to say because we're still in, we're still fairly close to the beginning. The students involved who are now year 8, they talk to me about it, so they'll talk in their other lessons or I go into those. So they talk about that project. They also quite excitedly ask, what are this year's year 7s doing? Because we did that, we had a part in that. What is coming next? So it's an interest beyond those sculptors as well. So how they will feel in that period of time, I suppose it's a bit, but like you mentioned earlier, around a site, people then go about their sort of day and they move around things quite quickly and don't always take the time to stop and look at them. But then there are points in our school year, so when we have open evenings, so they became part of the sort of trail of how new parents, new students would move around the site, so they kind of feature in that. And there's been sort of talk about having almost, I suppose, a bit like a kind of gallery space or having that space on our school website, so they feature. I think it might be sort of, like I said, too soon to tell what they might do in a few years. Certainly when we had the launch event and and parents were invited, we had a really nice turnout of those students, some whom they had that direct link, were photographed with RAF and their work as well. So maybe too early to tell.
Yeah, we'll do it again in 50 years' time and track down the students and maybe they could take part and talk about how they inspire their career as a successful sculptor. Just to remind people, I've got two more questions. One for Hugo and one for both Dawn and Hugo. But if you have comments or questions, feel free to type them in the chat. I'll bring them in as we're chatting if I can, if they're relevant. If not, obviously there's time at the end for comments, questions from attendees. Hugo, you mentioned the relationship between sculpture and pedagogy, so curriculum, teaching methods, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that, about sort of the questions that you think are particularly interesting to ask about the relationship between a sculpture in a school and the formal learning that happens in that school. And obviously, Dawn, there may well be things that you want to come in on there as well. So please do feel free to comment on that. But I'll ask it to Hugo first.
Thanks, Dave. So I'm not a teacher, and I guess I come at this from a kind of a perspective of a curator, and I'm part of that kind of the visual arts infrastructure that kind of leans into that. I think there's a really interesting gap that seems to me to exist between maybe three kind of strands of working which exist, that kind of model which I think is dominant within the kind of the Leicestershire Education Authority's kind of collection, which was buying stuff from gallerists, which was thought to look nice and be creative and stimulant in and putting it in schools. I think there's then a model where artists are brought into schools in quite an open way, that they're brought in with a as artists in residence to kind of negotiate the space and potentially produce something. I think that's a really interesting thing that we haven't really touched on there, and kind of which is that actually the sculptural commission wasn't the starting point for that process from the sounds of things, but that's something that grew out of that process. And I think kind of that's probably the most rewarding way of working. And then there's another model where you actually have quite tight briefs in terms of what an educational setting is looking for from an artist, whether that's in terms of a final product which does a particular thing, so a climbing frame designed by an artist, or a set of workshops for a particular cohort of young people which delivers particular curricular outcomes. And I think kind of like they land quite differently, and I think different artists and practitioners can respond in different ways. I think for me, it seems the projects I've been involved in the school settings have landed most successfully where there's quite a lot of flexibility in terms of what's being developed, and I think a sense of student and staff engagement with the kind of the development process. And I think there's something kind of really important about the idea of activation, that if you're creating these kind of structures and spaces, that actually commissioning artists or having those artists who produce them, bring those to life, demonstrating how they can be used or utilized, is a really helpful tool. But I think also you're kind of like talking about ideas of permanence, and for me, that's a kind of a museumification of a live space, that actually, if an artwork remains relevant and meaningful, as Dunstable Real seems to have done because it was refound and reinstalled, that's really great. That's really positive. But I don't think that has to be a given. I don't think there's a moral imperative on a school to become the custodians and conservators of an artwork. It's a tool, and it's something that does amazing things potentially for the young people, but it doesn't have to become a responsibility or a burden. And so I think I'm going to come back to kind of like Countersthorpe, circle back to Countersthorpe in kind of like 1971 when it opens with Dunstable Real at the centre, and a really flexible curriculum, or no curriculum, or a flexible curriculum which is negotiated in a bespoke way with each student working out their own kind of work plans across the week, across the term. And but artwork at its best probably opens up that kind of a space. I think I probably get most excited about artists working outside of the context of kind of visual arts within school settings. I think sculpture is inextricably linked with architecture in the context of schools, and I think it's very difficult to kind of get away from that sense of it both functioning as kind of an artwork but also as a design feature, and thinking through again how relevant that is as we refurbish or rethink through school spaces, that sometimes it remains relevant, sometimes it kind of shifts. I think for me there's also something which we don't talk about that much, and this applies beyond the context of kind of like sculpture in schools. It's more about public arts broadly, which is that idea of what starts to happen as something embeds into a landscape and it disappears into the landscape. That doesn't mean it disappears, but it means we lose our awareness of it. And there are really interesting kind of activations and artists who work in ways which don't produce sculpture, but actually kind of like point at it. So kind of like Simon and Tom Bloor are artists who've done quite a lot of work in terms of around public sculpture. I'm going to get the name of the artist, which isn't ideal, but there's a sculptor from similar periods to kind of the Leicestershire collection who created these kind of play sculptures. They were designed to be played on, and he sort of almost disappeared. And so kind of Simon and Tom did quite a lot of archival work around kind of like bringing focus to his practice. So I think there are lots of ways into engaging with kind of art objects and sculptures within the schools. I think and Dawn can kind of like correct me if she feels that I'm wrong on this, but my instincts would be it gets harder with time. Having something which has just landed in your space and is new and is bright and is kind of visible is a much easier, it's a more straightforward prompt or cue for certain kinds of activity than a bronze Lynn Chadwick that has been sitting there for 60 years. So that kind of liveness matters, and how it sort of sits in memorialization. And I'd say we are talking about sculpture, we're talking about visual arts, but actually the kind of the environment that was created at Countersthorpe was super open in terms of its idea of creativity. It was about establishing and supporting young people in whatever kind of creative path and valuing those creative paths as they kind of followed them. So music was the largest kind of cultural output. And so my favourite bit of history around Countersthorpe is slightly later than kind of 71, I think it's like 75, 76, was it was the first school to include and teach pop music within its kind of music curriculum. I mean, which seems to me extraordinary now that kind of it took that long. But that sense of creativity in a broad sense was really rooted in that kind of the Leicester collection. And I think it's also kind of something which I liked, which is this is kind of like oral history around it, was the teachers didn't love Dunstable Reel. Like, it was there and they were a bit baffled by it. It was kind of, you know, modernist colorist sculpture was around, but it wasn't necessarily dominant. So yeah, there's kind of, and I think that creates an interesting space as well, as where sculptures don't land with the community. Like, what happens then? How do you negotiate a space in which you're able to say, I don't love it. Like, it's here and it is, but actually I want to have a productive kind of conversation around it, but it's not something I'm super excited about. So that seems to me, I'm genuinely interested in that. Is that kind of empowering young people to be like, I don't like it. That seems to me, and that's a legitimate response. I'm not overselling it. I mean, kind of like, preferably will like it, but yeah. So I think kind of there's lots of different flavors kind of engagement with it, but I think easier to engage when something's landed recently, and so kind of liveness and kind of ephemeral practices are in some ways easier to sustain, which is the opposite of the way we're kind of presenting sculpture, I think. And a sense of that the less tied to curricular outputs they are, the more open the kind of the responses are able to be. Probably the more exciting maybe the young people's kind of experience of the work is going to be.
Brilliant, thanks Hugo. I just checked and I was right, and Kasabian formed at Countersthorpe, so I don't know if that's
the Countersthorpe
an endorsement or an indictment.
Crazy.
Yeah. of their Dawn, is there anything you wanted to come in on there?
Yeah, I was just thinking that in terms of the artworks at St. Peter's, the chances are it will be almost a generation. You'll then have the students that come up who they'll say, you know, my mum or my dad were part of that project, or they were, you know, they worked with that artist, and so there could be we go from maybe sort of 2, 3, 4, 5 years where our students that were part of it are still present in school, who then a whole and we do have that. We have, you know, sort of generations of families, the same family that have come through the school. So it will be, well, I probably won't be there by then, but you know, it's, I think that, you know, that could certainly be part of it. And thinking about what you were just saying, Hugo, with where there aren't those kind of tight restrictions, and certainly from what you've said about what's happened in the past with the kind of Leicestershire collection, this experience that our students have had, where they're, you know, actively working with an artist and have had that interaction and then seeing the changes, the transformation to those parts of our school. It's just such an incredible experience for them. I think it would be for any young person, but certainly our intake at the school, lots of our students haven't travelled outside Huntingdon, you know, maybe as far as Peterborough, certainly not to London, to galleries, you know, other than trips and that sort of thing that we're perhaps doing, but it's not something they would have actively done. And so to be able to bring that into the school through the work with Weissing and the artists is you know, incredibly important to us.
Brilliant, thanks so much. I'm conscious that obviously the event will finish in 20 minutes, and I want to make sure that we finish on time so people can enjoy the rest of their evening. But I'm just going to ask a question, so it follows on nicely from that, really, about institutional memory across time. So one of the issues I have with sculptures at Loughborough is we have sculptures we don't know what they are. We have some, and we're not sure how they came to campus. We don't know who acquired them or why. And obviously other sculptures from the heyday of Leicestershire's Art in Schools programme, you know, they're all between kind of 50 and 75 years old. Some have been damaged, some have been lost, some have been destroyed. And as Hugo said, you know, maybe that's fine if they're not relevant anymore, if they're dangerous. Schools don't have the knowledge or necessarily the money to, then, you know, they're not conservators, they're not museums. But so I wanted to open up a space really to invite people for reflections on what happens to sculptures in schools over time. Do we need to put things in place to ensure that the institution knows what they are, even after those who were directly involved in the project have left? Do sculptures that belong to a different moment in history still have something to offer? So I'll throw that open to both of you, and then we'll open up the floor to questions.
Yeah, I think certainly at St Peter's it would be really valuable to document the project, so it's there beyond the life at the time of the people directly involved in the project. How we do that, probably some form of cataloguing, and there could be quite easily a space for it on the school's website. But I do think how we go about or theming kind of the life of that piece, I suppose that would be involved in the way it's been made. But I do think it's important that we kind of secure for the future why it was there, how it came about, and that it has importance.
Hugo, do you?
Yeah, so there is we work in the arts. We believe there's an inherent value to these objects. That's kind of what underpins our practice. So I'm not sure that I'm strongly advocating for them being left to decay, but I think kind of there is a genuine problem or challenge which I think will restrict the way sculptural practices and visual arts practice can be distributed through schools if there is a sense of an ethical obligation for the preservation and upkeep of the works indefinitely. That doesn't mean that if you're working with kind of partners like Henry Moore Foundation to kind of co-fund this, that there isn't a strategy where you have someone within the school who has some responsibility and they can go back to Henry Moore for kind of some conservation costs as required. But I think it's maybe just a variegated model that actually, as you say, David, kind of there are things that simply cycle through their usable, meaningful time slot. And with a museum, there's kind of all the infrastructure of like deaccessioning and processes to ensure that these objects are responsibly managed. So perhaps actually that's what is required, is some kind of like centralized infrastructure, bureaucratic, because the arts need more bureaucracy, but like some kind of like infrastructure which allows schools to manage at a national level these kind of objects which are potentially really problematic. I mean, I think it's really interesting the Countersthorpe Dunstable Reel. They found it and resolved it, but there's an undertone to quite a lot of the coverage of it, which is like, how did they lose it? How did they not know it was worth £180,000? And of course, why would they? Unless they had a kind of like a mid-century modern valuation on it, you wouldn't know. So I think kind of, I think what I'm going at is something which is kind of like outside of individual schools' responsibility, which is able to support or facilitate this kind of activity, to go round a school campus and say, actually, this artwork is £45,000. Don't sell it for £360. Sell it by all means, but you should get more than that, or pass it on to a collector or collection. And etc. So I think there is a kind of an obligation to sustain it, but I think for me it's really important that doesn't fall to the schools to carry that responsibility. and I think the corollary of that is that I do also think kind of part of that obligation then is an aesthetic obligation to keep it alive. And then if you are going to have it, to find out ways to utilize or bring it to life. And I think kind of what we're talking about in terms of the artist's participation, that experience of an artist is transformational. Like at its best, it's just extraordinary for young people to have that kind of access, that sense of a world that they wouldn't otherwise have contact with. And so if there's kind of ways to sustain the relationship with the artist over periods of time, and there's obviously some resourcing issues around that, but kind of thinking through how long you can keep that alive for. And I think kind of that idea of it being generational is really beautiful. That idea that because practice now often has that kind of direct involvement of the student base, that actually to go back where there's a school which has a strong kind of intergenerational uptake, that you will refer to this kind of artwork that your father was or your mother was involved in producing is a really lovely way of kind of keeping it alive. So yes, I think there's a responsibility, but I think I guess my key one is for that responsibility not to fall onto the shoulders of schools, and for schools not to be expected by the press particularly to be able to carry that responsibility.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, it's something to think about as well in my work, and kind of, how as an institution, how do you make those decisions? And one thing that things can become relevant in the future that we just weren't thought of at the time. So one of the questions I've had with some of the works on our campus is, does it have asbestos in? And I don't know, because I don't have those records. And clearly, Raphael's work hasn't got asbestos in, but in 50 years' time, who knows what, and so the all these tricky questions that are difficult for galleries, and galleries often don't have the funding to deal with, but they are institutions explicitly designed to manage and deal with these issues. So expecting, schools, it's a really, and that's in a sense. Yeah, sorry, go on, you go.
Well, so you finish first.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's kind of the sort of issues that I was really hoping would come up tonight, and thinking that's why I called the event the Afterlives as well as just the lives. What happens beyond what can be foreseen, essentially.
So I was going to just pick up on, and this is in sort of a question for Dawn, I guess, which is that I'm super interested. So obviously there's this brilliant relationship between Raphael and the school, but it also sounds like there's a really warm relationship between Weissing and the school. And so I'm really interested in how the institutional relationships kind of underpin a project like this. And I think this idea of trust, this kind of informality of a process of kind of like relatively incremental, small kind of activity, which then develops into something which is a long-term kind of sighted sculptural work. But also I'm then thinking about kind of in terms of responsibility, whether or not Weissing has an on-running investment in being engaged with and supporting the visibility and the activation of the sculpture.
Just before you answer that, Dawn, I was going to say, if people have questions, please feel free. If you can work out how to raise your hand using the Zoom raise your hand function, please do. If not, you can either type the question in the chat, or you can just type in the chat, I have a question, and then I'll call people. But Dawn, if you want to respond to Hugo first.
Yes, obviously we do have this, the relationship with Weissing. As I said, it's grown over a number of years. And we've been able to develop this project, and the kind of the one that's working through this year. I suppose if we think that you've actually found out about the artwork via Weissing's website, David shows you that they are kind of publicising that relationship that we've had working with them, and like a recent piece that Raf's just unveiled at Weissing as well, kind of brings back round another link between St. Peter's and themselves. I don't know if I can speak for Weissing as to the responsibility they would have for looking after the artwork, but certainly kind of pinpointing it, if you like, promoting it, and that link we've got with Raf. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. So there's a question in the chat from Nina, and thanks very much. It's a really a good one about whether there's a case to be made for adding Raphael's works to artuk.org. So I don't know if you know Art UK, Dawn, at all, or if you're familiar.
I have heard of it, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a public art cataloguing project. Receives public money, and they very ambitiously aimed to document every oil painting and sculpture in public ownership. So they led those projects where they got in touch with public bodies and said, do you have oil paintings in your collection? Do you have sculpture in your collection? And then they added them to the Art UK website. Those projects are now finished, but institutions can get in touch and have those works added. And institutions can also pay when you can add works that aren't in those aren't oil paintings or sculptures. It's a great project. We use it a lot. I'm actually giving a talk for Art UK on Wednesday about our sculpture collection. But it's quite labour intensive. Obviously, adding the work, and then you might. It's unlikely, but sometimes you do get inquiries about the work. But if that would be of interest, Dawn, feel free to get in touch after the event, because I use it quite regularly. But yeah, I think it's a good question. But I guess again, it's that question where for museums, absolutely, and a museum that doesn't add its work to Art UK, I think there are questions as to why. Often resource, and that's understandable. But ideally, that's the kind of work museums should be doing. But in a school, teachers are overworked. Workloads are huge. Who does it? Who is responsible? So, absolutely, it's a great question. I think there's a very clear case to adding them to Art UK, but also who does it? And and schools don't do it. Very, very few of the Leicestershire works on there. It's really only the ones that the Leicestershire owns itself. So some of which were in schools and have gone back to the county and are either in store or have been installed at a stately home that the county owns. The county, Leicestershire itself, did add those to Art UK, but I don't think any of the Leicestershire schools, who I presume were contacted, did add their work to Art UK.
Thank you. Yeah, that sounds like a great idea.
Yeah. Although last time I logged into Art UK, there's a survey on there which hypothetically asks you to think about what would happen if Art UK didn't receive funding. So, and you've asked about what Raphael's sculpture looks like. I'll share my screen again and just show some of the images. Just to say, Raphael, as Dawn's mentioned, Raphael is here with us this evening, and I very much don't want Raphael to feel obliged to speak. Obviously, we're not paying Raphael as a contributor, so I don't want to put any obligation or onus. But Raphael, if you do feel like you want to respond to anything or add anything to what's been said, please absolutely feel free, but don't feel obliged. Also, I'll just share my screen so people can see the work. Again, bear with me. There we go. Again, how many sculptures in total are there, Dawn? Sorry.
So there's the main piece, which is the bottom middle, and then there are 4 other pieces.
Super. So so the 5 pieces are all
all feature. Yeah. So the 3 that are in the niches are now behind a perspex acrylic panel to protect them as well.
Yeah, I don't know. If we ran out of time, if I needed more questions, I was going to ask if students had added their own chewing gum to the.
So it was there when they did it in the workshop. They chewed the gum in the workshop.
Yeah.
Those pieces were collected on a thin rectangular piece of board, which you can see then embedded into that. The green sculpture, the heads on the left-hand side.
You haven't had other unwanted chewing gum added, or
Oh
maybe
no, nothing added over the top. No, no. Though everything is safe. I'll let you know that, Ralph, as well. We haven't sold anything. They're all on site. Yeah.
Ralph, did you want to come in and say something then? I think I need to give you power to unmute, so I'll do that. Yeah, please feel free to say anything that you'd like.
Hello?
Hi, yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, no, actually, the chewing gums were actually cast. So I used the students' chewing gums and then I cast the panel. So they're not the real chewing gums; they're actually casts of the chewing gums. Yeah, you know what? I mean, like, it was quite a life-changing project for me as well, and that's why I'm quite interested to hear all this conversation, because I mean, the whole thing when I was asked to do the workshop around the school, we didn't knew we were going to make something physical. We're going to make any sort of physical kind of residue of it. But I mean, like, I myself, I'm a big fan of that post-war period of the schools and the universities. So I felt like, oh my God, if I've got given such an opportunity here, let's just try to make it physical. Let's just see what can be done. And and that's when the kind of the magic started happening. Being around those spaces, as you mentioned, looking at the space quite architecturally, looking at the things that can kind of operate within the space, but also thinking about the things that kind of like, as I said, they are made with the students, but also they're kind of the signposts. They're going to be the things that people are going to be spending days together. So they're going to become this kind of fabric of their kind of all mythologizing their experience as well. So I wanted to do something which is kind of like done here and now. We were here, we made the mark, but also this is the mark that stays. And I mean, perhaps that's I could speak for ages, but that's like a nice little note I would like to leave here. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for joining us.
That's all right.
So any other questions or comments from the floor? No? Okay, then I suggest we close the event for there. I'll just pop a link in the chat. Some promo, so for Sculpture Week, for the rest of the events, as I said, some are in Loughborough, but there is, I'm giving a talk online for Art UK on Wednesday at 5:30, I believe. The link to book is on that website. And I think that talk will be made available via Art UK's YouTube channel afterwards. One other thing that I was going to mention is this little pack called Cleaved Into, and this relates to something you said, Hugo, about artists who sort of respond to existing work and prompt engagement with sculptures in the public realm. And this was a pack that we commissioned from the artist collective Neuschloss, and it encourages people who have a copy to go out on our campus and engage in a kind of playful, creative way with the sculptures. So there's these sort of fun little exercises that produce short pieces of experimental writing, or you use adjectives to describe a work, or write a short description, give the description to someone else, and they then draw what they think the sculpture looks like based on your description. And if people would like one of these, feel free to get in touch. I'll put my email address in the chat, because we can post these out. And although it was designed specifically with Loughborough's collection in mind, really the exercises work with any public sculpture. So if you've got, or it doesn't have to be a sculpture, but if you've got objects or sculptures that nearby, then we can pop them in the post, and they're free of charge. So it's a lovely little pack. And it's a nice way to engage, I think, with the sculpture. So all that remains really, unless anyone has anything else they want to add, is to say thank you so much to everyone for coming, and particularly to Dawn and Hugo for their time on a Monday evening. Thanks ever so much. Hope to see you again soon, and enjoy the rest of your night. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for inviting us, David.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.